All right. Well, this is a very exciting moment. This is our first X Spaces town hall. I am hopeful that uh, this will be a method through which we can get more people to pay a bit of attention or enter their mind space, get on their radar about all the good work that's been happening here over the past year plus in Pinto, over the past 5+ years, in the bigger picture of algo stable development, low volatility money development, if you will. So, as we talked about last week in our Discord town hall, uh, we're going to run this a little bit differently, where instead of having all of the contributors start by sharing what they're working on, which often takes a bit of time and might not have the most resonance with a Twitter audience that may just be popping in or poking around. We're going to run this a little bit differently, which is to say that we're going to focus on discussion and debate around the model and what works, what doesn't work, what's on people's minds, what problems people have, what FUD people have, uh, which hopefully will be a little bit more accessible content for people than some of the more technical status updates that we often get from people. So with that, um, I think the best thing to do is to open up the floor. I know we have some community members here that often have questions and comments, so I'm hopeful that we'll hear from them. And then separately, uh, I've got some stuff on my mind that if there ends up being time, we can also talk about. So with that, let's open up the floor for the first time on X. Welcome, everyone.
GM,
Yeah,
GM.
I was just gonna say that maybe in the future we don't have to do it this week, depending on how conversation goes. It might be nice to have like a brief update from Freehold, just describing across progress, what has been happening, what are the highlights, within a minute or something. Um, but we can, think about that depending on how this goes.
Great. That's a great point, sir. All right, the floor is open, folks. What's on people's minds?
I can always say something, but I would love to have someone else say something if someone else has something else to say.
Wow. Hit us, Ford.
All right. Maybe you can refresh us on what you're thinking for the next iteration of model improvements.
Sure. So there's
And just to clarify, by next iteration, I mean like not a new fork, but like on Pinto. Like how can we improve Pinto to get it back to pay to get it growing?
well, in my mind, the fork discussion has absolutely nothing to do with the model improvement. So that's an easy request to honor because ultimately the goal is to take what we have and take it as far as we can. So I generally think about like governance and governance related issues, which to me is probably the main thing that has to be like radically changed with Pinto. Obviously, the way that we've been doing governance is not what you might call a long-term sustainable method, right? Where we have a multi-sig governance and no real DAO structure. So when we talk about like, not to digress as to forking, but to me the only real change that needs to be made from that perspective, which I think probably you could say, even if we migrate to a new system of governance, still falls short of a fork, although that's more of like a language question. With respect to the economic model, there's really two levels to major improvements that are possible at this moment and strike me as prudent to consider deeply. One is to figure out how the protocol can best manage and allocate its liquidity along a liquidity curve, which is to say that right now the protocol is at an equilibrium and is low volatility, but it is low volatility at the wrong price.
I think we lost Ben there. No.
Yeah, I lost him too.
Yeah.
People
Welcome
hear me
back.
now?
Yes.
Can people hear me now? Cool. I could hear you guys, and the system said I was speaking, so I thought I was losing my mind. Apologies for that. So I think does someone want to remind me exactly where they lost me? Otherwise, I can just sort of pick up.
You were saying that we're like at 30 cents and it's not volatile, so to some degree, it's like it's working.
Well, we're at an equilibrium. I think working is where the rubber meets the road, which is to say that objectively the system could be working much better, right? Like the price could be at or significantly closer to its value target. Being steady at 80 cents is materially different than being steady at 30 cents. And so while the system does seem to have found some equilibrium, which is in and of itself quite exciting and validating of the work that's happening here. You know, you look at Beanstalk, and it's like, well, you can make an argument that even though it is pretty low volatility, it is mostly low volatility because all of the value that is in the system is currently locked, right? And so the fact that Pinto doesn't have any locked value in the same sense and is still stable in the same price range is definitely interesting data and encouraging data. But it's like, okay, there's clearly room for improvement with respect to the price at which the system is able to create equilibrium. And so the discussion there, which we've spent, I think, quite a bit of time on at this point, is that the system needs to figure out a way to manage its liquidity more effectively. Perhaps that means that in certain instances the protocol can automatically convert liquidity, likely through some sort of group convert, where all of the value that is deposited in the silo, the protocol under certain conditions can convert. And as we've talked about, to implement some sort of convert like that actually requires defining some higher level monetary policy goals. Under what circumstances should the system be prioritizing liquidity at all costs? Is there a way to evaluate how the system is able to, over time, across multiple seasons, evaluate outflows from the system such that it can determine that it's found some new equilibrium and therefore it can start to raise the price, as an example. So there's some really interesting axes in the design space there. But I think the punchline is that the most obvious and I don't know if we could say easiest, because at this point it's a pretty massive task to try to design a system like this, both from a technical, as we've talked about with Frio, what it would look like to actually implement a mechanism that is manipulation resistant to do this, in addition to trying to determine when to convert. Theoretically, when should the system be converting? When should it be changing the price? Should it ever be lowering the price? And then related to this, and this is now, I think, a segue into the second topic. But the other angle is around utility and yield generated by the system, which is to say that the utility of the currency is really a function of its volatility, and you could say deviation from the peg, even if it's low volatility, and the yield, right? And the like, I think if we look at Pinto objectively, the system did grow too fast. It grew too much. It grew too quickly during that initial flood period, and so there's a very clear question there around, okay, like, is there a way for the system to better manage its growth, to potentially distribute the yield to holders that are more long-term oriented? Like, it's not just the fact that the system grew too quickly, it's that the mints were distributed immediately or almost immediately to holders that have ultimately left the system. And so it's like, whereas, and obviously we're talking theoretically here, but whereas had the system only distributed the proceeds from the flood to holders of the system that are still here and have not exited, or have not exited significantly, there's a lot of reason to believe the system would be in a healthier spot. And so as soon as we get into the question of yield distribution, like, I think topic one is around volatility minimization and deviation from peg minimization, and there's a question of over what period of time, where you can minimize short-term volatility at the cost of longer-term volatility. Like, that's in and of itself a very interesting conversation. But then separately, it's like, okay, the other piece of the puzzle is yield, and the question is, where does the system get its yield from? Where does it generate the demand that ultimately leads to new currency getting minted? Are there more sustainable sources of yield than just speculative demand? Is it better to keep the demand entirely speculative, versus, as we talk about utility for Pinto, is there a way to pair utility for the currency with some sort of more sustainable source of yield? And then a related question is, should the yield continue to be distributed in real time as it has been? Should there be some sort of delay in yield? Should there be some system where the yield gets allocated but is locked up for a period of time, or if you leave, now there's some forfeiture of future expected return? Should there be a cap in the yield such that you really prevent these runaway printing situations? Excuse me. So those are I think the two main areas for improvement, both of which are major topics in their own right. So that's where my head is at generally.
Awesome. Do you want to dig deeper into any of those? Like, you mentioned kind of a higher level monetary policy needs to be defined in order to work on stuff like group convert up.
Yeah. So the monetary policy question is a very I think difficult gets at the problem, but probably isn't exactly fair. Like when you think about what the Federal Reserve is doing, in some sense, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is running the same calculus in practice, where they like, what is inflation, right? Inflation is a change in the value of the U.S. dollar, and the Federal Reserve Board of Governors has a mandate to focus on the targeting of the value of the currency a year from now as being 98 cents on today's dollar. And so they have a price target, and then their primary method through which they can adjust the price is really through changing the interest rate of the treasury bills that are being sold. And while the exact mechanism through which the Board of Governors ultimately are able to change the interest rate such that that should increase or decrease the expected rate of inflation in the economy and the expected rate of growth in the economy, because lending is downstream of the interest rate, and therefore productive economic activity is downstream of the interest rate. Whereas in a system like Pinto, the mechanism through which the price is changed, there's sort of there is an interest rate changing component, but because this is a very undeveloped system, the mechanism through which the price actually is changed is much more direct, at least in the iteration that we're talking about, where the protocol now has some explicit ability to actually change the price in the market. Now, there's all sorts of open market operations that the Fed actually does in practice, where they are in practice underwriting certain loans, and in the case of quantitative easing, for example, making commitments to actually buy in the market certain assets at, let's call it, a fair market value. And I put that a little bit in quotes, because ultimately they really get to determine the fair market value. And it's like, well, in the absence of the market having a real opportunity to price these assets that the Fed is purchasing, because in fact, in sort of like an ironic catch-22 way, the Fed is actually purchasing the assets at the price that they're purchasing them, because if the Fed failed to purchase them at that price, there would be other domino effects that could actually lead to bigger problems in the economy. So the current manifestation of the monetary policy that the Fed is doing, which is something that we should study quite thoroughly as we're starting to create a more sophisticated monetary policy here, is that the Fed is actually similar to what we're talking about, performing open market operations to, in practice, you can say, like, maintain the value of the dollar, where there's a credible argument that if the Fed failed to act, if the Fed effectively let the market reprice some of these assets the Fed is in practice propping up through its purchasing of, that would actually have significant effects on the value of the dollar, both in the short term in the form of excess volatility, and in the long term in the form of the sustainability of the economy. And so what I think about as I'm thinking about trying to design the monetary policy of this system, it's really twofold, right? The first is, how do we avoid that situation that the Fed is ultimately in? Like, the failure mode for the current system is this, which is to say that the Fed is currently preventing price discovery of assets, and in doing so is actually manipulating the economy and hurting the ability for markets to serve source of information as a source of information that allow people to collaborate with one another. And so the fact that they're putting their fat fingers on the scale and corrupting the data on the market, on the global economy, is actually a big problem. And as I look around and I think about the larger crypto story that is happening here, that Pinto is very much a part of that story. Like at the end of the day, a lot of the suffering of my generation, for example, I believe is downstream of the fact that the Fed has this fat finger on the scale that is, for example, and this is a bit indirect, but leading to an environment such that the previous generation has multiple houses and I can't afford an apartment, right? So to me, as I think about creating monetary policy in this context, it's actually not just about minimizing the volatility, and it's not just about minimizing the magnitude from the value target. It's about creating the sustainability in a way that is fundamentally more sustainable, fundamentally healthier in its nature, fundamentally not compromising or sacrificing or damaging the function of markets. And so where I think where the lines start to blur between these two topics is exactly here, which is to say that the ability to automatically buy or automatically sell in the market when there's a price deviation, or refraining from distributing yield that otherwise would have been distributed, and creating certain rules or restrictions on who gets to receive the yield and what behaviors do they need to take, what exposure to Pinto do they need to hold over what period of time, and then a layer deeper, which is the sources of the yield, the sources of utility of Pinto, like insofar as there is a way to tie up the utility of the currency with the sources of the yield at a deeper level, that the monetary policy also has to come in there, where it's like at some level the ability for a new system like Pinto to compete with the existing system is going to be downstream of its ability to make productive loans, for example, and to manage those loans. How do we manage lending in a system like this where there's no real opportunity cost? There is like a second order opportunity cost, but the system can lend out a lot of money in theory. How do we handle the issuance of those loans? How do we make sure that insofar as there is a money printer here and we are using and leveraging the money printer, I say using it as efficiently as possible, leveraging it probably not as much as possible, but still leveraging the money printer? How do we create rules around that where it's like there is actually, in some sense, permissionless access to the money printer, permissionless access to credit, but to do it, it cannot be gamed, that it's very difficult to take advantage of the system. And then when we think about the externalities of the system, that the way that it's set up, it ultimately doesn't lead to, I think Balaji actually just put out some content with this metaphor, which is great. It is a perfect, maybe it's actually an analogy, but it's a perfect real world example of the phenomenon that has played out, which is he talks about in these deep sea trenches that you have these sulfur repositories. I don't know what you want to call them, where there's like a fountain of sulfur that's springing out from the ocean floor, and you have a significant disproportional amount of life in the deep sea that is huddled around or has formed around these sulfur fountains. I forget the word. And that is exactly, go ahead.
Vents.
Yes, vents. I think a vent is good. And so that is my mental model for the current U.S. economy and why it's so messed up, which is that you have this massive sulfuric vent, which is the Fed and the money printer, and there's only a couple ways to get access to it. You either got to be friends with Congress, you got to be friends with Wall Street, but if you're just a regular dude who grew up in the suburbs like I did, you're not that connected to the money printer. And if you grew up in bumfuck Arkansas, then you're totally shit out of luck and you have no connection whatsoever to the money printer. And so, the bigger picture discussion here is, as we start to think about, and I think with respect to just minimizing volatility and minimizing deviations from the value target, there is still work that can be done to, if you think about the volatility and the deviation from the value targets as sort of the cost, it's like what are the downsides of using something like Pinto? Those are the main sources of downside. So there's definitely more that we can do just currently to potentially minimize volatility. But to me, in order to put us on the best path to success, it will be much healthier to think ahead and think about, okay, well, how can we prevent over-minting? How can we ensure that when we do have to mint, that the mints are distributed in such a fashion that it minimizes volatility in the future? How can we create the most sustainable sources of yield? But then I think the biggest question is, assuming that we are able to figure out, and this is a question that we've talked a lot about on this. I remember even, as many as 4 months ago, we had a very interesting discussion about it, and even further back, talking about how to make that a system like Pinto can actually lend out capital at a lower interest rate than the federal funds rate, for example. And that's there's a micro level thing of enabling that so it's free of arbitrage, but then there's a more macro social organization level thing on how do we actually facilitate the loans and how many loans to give out, who's able to give out a loan, how is the risk there managed, how is the return there managed. These are all, to me, deeply related to monetary policy. And when you think about the traditional monetary policy and you think about money supply and interest rates, maybe you don't really get there, right? But when you start to think about the economy and how the money printer is ultimately the foremost element in the modern economy, I think we can probably all agree on that actually the next iteration really needs to be focused around unlocking the power of the money printer, restraining it such that we don't print too much, a la what happened during this first flood, and ultimately figuring out a way to democratize the lending capacity of the money printer and the ability to make productive loans while minimizing the amount of value that can be extracted. So not exactly, and listen, there is a traditional monetary policy question, right? Which is just, can we read the current inflows and outflows from the system over some time and come to some determination on whether or not it's safe or sustainable for the system to convert up. So that's what's in my mind at the moment with respect to monetary policy.
That seemed pretty abstract, I guess, to say the least. What does that mean in concrete terms for Pinto?
Well, that remains to be seen. One of the things that's difficult about, and I'm sorry if you hear some sirens. I'm just ended up next to a bus that's got sirens somehow. The way that we've generally developed Beanstalk and Pinto has changed over time, largely downstream of the state of the system. So when we started and there was nothing live, we really tried to put the best model in place within reason when we deployed originally. And it did pretty good. It was the best model at the time. I would argue still the best model to date, other than the models downstream of it. But when we put out the original model, there were so many problems, and because it was live and it was doing stuff that it was quite inefficient and dangerous, it was necessary basically to put out upgrades constantly, where the upgrades were almost an immediate response or reaction to a problem that we were witnessing with the system in the wild. And that's quite a different circumstance than where we have found ourselves over the past couple of years, where the system is relatively sustainable, meaning, in some sense, the most dangerous thing that the model has dealt with over the past 6 months plus is really the continued decrease of the excessively low L2SR threshold parameter, which has led to, and this is deeply related to the discussion we're currently having, which has led to the system encouraging more converts up, which has led to higher exit prices for people that have left the system, which has now led to worse health for the system in its current form. And so, there's a reasonable argument to be made that, in fact, the short-term and listen, I'm comfortable defending the decision. I think that we've gotten some very positive and meaningful data about the model and about how the ratio of seeds actually, in practice, does have an effect on the long-term price and volatility of the system. Like, very meaningful data, but from a system health perspective, it's been very expensive. The amount of liquidity in the system has decreased basically a full order of magnitude since we started to make these changes. And that is something that I think we need to be very mindful of, where on the one hand, it's reasonable to say, okay, so what monetary policy changes are we going to make for Pinto? And it's like, well, let's be careful here. We've only got a couple $100,000 of liquidity left. In my mind, it's hard to imagine more liquidity coming in until the system is able to prove itself and demonstrate some sort of efficacy at peg maintenance. And so in my mind, it's a little bit like, well, the value that we currently have is what we have to deal with right now. And so we should be quite conservative. So I think the most relevant or immediate, and I use immediate very cautiously, but the most immediate result for Pinto is we need to have a bigger discussion about how, given the current state of the system can potentially work its way out of this hole it's in right now, where it has incredibly low volatility, but also incredibly low liquidity. And so the fact that we don't have more downside more downside volatility is definitely a positive data point and exciting in its own right. right? Like I think if we're looking for and we're trying to be objective, the fact that the system actually has such low volatility, even though it has almost no liquidity, means that we've discovered an equilibrium point, which is quite meaningful. I think we are in very delicate territory right now, and like the monetary policy that we're talking about, where the system auto converts, to introduce the auto convert at a period of time where there's really little room for error, is going to be a very complex and difficult thing to get right. So all of this is to say, I don't expect an immediate fix here for Pinto. I think it's much more prudent to think about this at a higher level and try to come up with a plan. Excuse me, I sneezed again. But to come up with a plan where the plan doesn't just include how could, in theory, the system work its way out of its hole right now, but a plan in the context of, okay, this is where we see the monetary policy of the system going, and we think that this is a way to parameterize such a mechanism, such a system, that we think gives the system the best possible chance in its current form to return to the value target and to demonstrate its efficacy. So might not be the most inspiring or exciting answer, but I don't think that this discussion turns into something for Pinto in the next 2 months. Like the next 2 months, in my mind, we already have a clear agenda in terms of what's being worked on to set us up to implement some bigger changes like this. And my hope is to use the time over the next couple months to get as far as we can in this larger discussion, such that there's no gap between when all of the current work that's specced out and scoped out is completed and when we're able to start implementing these bigger changes. So, well, I am very excited to have this discussion, and to me, it's super fun and exciting and meaningful that we're at this point where we can even have this discussion. At the same time, it's very important that we come to these discussions with a peaceful mind and keep in mind the fact that, even though we're in a good spot and have a lot of opportunity, this is also a very treacherous current situation, and it's also an incredibly complex problem, incredibly complex problem. And so, this isn't going to get resolved on this call. Let's put it that way.
Sure, sure. Maybe it makes sense to kind of define a framework for the best way to go about discussing this. Like the way I see it, there's only so many levers that the system can pull. Perhaps we define the available levers, and then go from there.
Yeah, that is, I think, one of the, like, maybe the starting point. And here, like, there's an open question here of how to best conduct these discussions in a public forum, which is to say that on the one hand, I think it's quite meaningful that we're able to have these discussions out in the open, and to do so in a way where really anyone can participate, and the work, the discovery, is happening on the historical record. To me, it's really cool. But at the same time, I want to make sure that we have an environment where the people that have the most insight to share on this front are actually comfortable sharing it. And that's something that I'm quite mindful of, which is to say that in the past, when we have like the way that the past year has gone with Pinto, a lot of almost all of the work that has transpired was scoped out in a series of in-person sessions where certain contributors or people in our community that often do not participate in these public town halls had a lot to share. And so what I'm mindful of in setting up an official process here is, in some sense, the thing we can use these town halls for is. Oh, did people lose me? Can people hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, we can hear you.
the thing that we should
All right,
use these town halls for is
my thing said it was lost, so I'm glad people can hear me. Is maybe to present the progress and as a chance to receive feedback, and for people to publicly push back insofar as they don't agree with certain concepts or make suggestions. But I'm not sure, and I'm interested in feedback whether this is the optimal format to have the entire discussion. Like, I'm nervous that some people may not participate. I also question if doing this weekly is enough. Like, the way that my mind works, typically it's preferred to minimize context switching and to really dive as deeply into the topic as I can at any one moment. So, in some sense, all of this is me responding toward your sort of suggestion that we put in place a method and then just go through them item by item. But the issue with that is I don't know if that's going to get us where we want to go in an efficient time period. So, food for thought there. I don't necessarily think I have the best solution here, but wanted to broach the topic given the question.
Awesome.
Like, the starting point for our discussion last year was exactly that, which is to say that we defined all of our axes on which the system could currently act, and like changing the seeds, for example, and then defining the axes on which the system could potentially act, and then talking about the problems, designing a mechanism to properly incentivize along a given axis, thinking about like some of the stock penalty work that we did and the stock bonus work. And ultimately, by putting the group's heads together, we were able to discover new methods through which we could unlock certain axes, like in particular, for example, the bonus. And so I expect some sort of similar process this time around. But yeah, it's going to be a little bit difficult to schedule something again, and there's a balance between having the discussion out in the open and making sure that the discussion has the maximum efficacy possible. So not so easy to get that right. But I think a good problem to have. In my mind, it's great that we have this opportunity to go back in and figure out in a very serious way what is the next year plus of work look like for this thing.
You're making it sound like the online meetings are not particularly useful then.
Well, useful from what perspective, right? Like, I find the town halls very useful from a keeping the community up to date perspective, from keeping a regular rapport with people, keeping people up to date on what's happening with the protocol, how things are going, etc. But an hour once a week, is not necessarily the best way to do super deep work, if you will.
Yeah, it makes sense. Makes sense.
And we get pretty far in a lot of these, like a lot of the work and the conversations that we have in these town halls are very thought-provoking and inspiring, I think, to say the least, if you know what I mean. Like many of the state-of-the-art ideas are downstream of the topics that we're talking about here. Like, how can we prevent arbitrage of the APY from the silo in order to facilitate lending? Like, that's a discussion that has been seared in my brain and has been running countless loops to try to figure out a real answer to that, because it's a legit problem. And so the fact that we're able to get so deep into it in this, even in an hour here, I think that call actually went a little over, if I recall correctly. But that's very meaningful in and of itself, because I think it is the current discussion, and it is where, like, as far as we've gotten as a collective, our minds figuring out how all of this is supposed to work. But to really take a significant leap forward, in my experience, that happens a lot more when you have longer blocks of time that are dedicated to solving specific problems, as opposed to like, oh, we hit the hour, we've got another meeting, we've got to run to. So just a question of what is the point of the meeting, and I find these sessions to be quite productive from having meaningful discussion and keeping people in the loop and up to speed, but that doesn't mean that this is the most productive method for us to discover new stuff.
Got it. Well, I still hope that we can at least get something out of them, because I think there's a lot to be discussed.
Me too. I love these. This is one of the reasons why we're moving this over to X, because I think there's so much to discuss that it's a shame that right now, in order to hear any of it, you've got to join the Discord. So the hope is by having these in X, we open it up a little bit more. All right. Well, we've got a couple minutes here left. If people have other questions, other topics, we can probably cover one more thing, is my guess. So floor is open. All right. Well, if no one has anything else they want to bring up, which I will leave the floor open again, we'll end a couple minutes early. So the floor is open one more time. No question is off the table. No FUD is off the table. This is an open forum. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. This was a great first space, and looking forward to talking again next week. Take care.
Thank you. See ya.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, guys.